Hi, everyone. Lior is here with another Jumpstart Lightning episode. This one is a bit of a special one because we're not going to talk about hybrid stuff precisely, but we are going to talk about some cool technology with Cluster API and the Azure provider. So stay tuned. Hi, everyone. Lior is here with another Jumpstart Lightning episode. This one is a special one because, unlike other episodes, today we're not going to talk about Azure Arc or hybrid, but we are going to talk about a very cool project, which is Cluster API. I have two distinguished ladies with me, Cecile and Bridget. Thank you, ladies, for joining me. First thing first, I'll start with you, Cecile. Thank you for joining. Who you are and what is it that you do?
Yeah, thanks, Lior. So I'm Cecile. I work at Microsoft in Azure Container Upstream. I'm a software engineer, and I'm one of the maintainers of Cluster API and Cluster API Provider Azure. I've been involved in the community for about 2 to 3 years now, and it's a very cool place to be involved.
Cecile, you and I have been talking for a while about a lot of things that got to do with Cluster API, so I'm excited to have you. Bridget, who you are and what is it that you do?
Thank you so much for having us there. I am a PM at Azure on this team supporting the upstream Kubernetes and container ecosystem, including supporting Cecile's team. And I've been involved in the Kubernetes ecosystem through this role and a previous role at Microsoft for about 5 years. And it's pretty exciting to see all of the work that we're able to do these days with creating very complex clusters. Cluster API is one of the ways people do that. So I'm excited to talk about that.
I'm always happy to talk to people that are swimming in the Kubernetes pool because it's such an exciting place to be and develop things around that. So really to kick things off, I think that the first thing that our viewers would like to understand, what is it that we're talking about today? And today we're talking about Cluster API. And I think to kick us off, Cecile, I want to ask you first thing first, what is Cluster API?
Yeah, so Cluster API is a sub-project of Kubernetes, and it's trying to bring a declarative API to create, manage, operate Kubernetes clusters. So what that means in practice is it's using Kubernetes to manage Kubernetes clusters.
Gotcha. So tell me something. Just first question to you in terms of Cluster API. How is it being used? Like, is it a project that we own as Microsoft?
That's a great question. Actually, Bridget, do you want to take that one?
Sure, absolutely. So I was smiling because your description, Cecile, made me think of the Cluster API logo. It's turtles all the way down because it's, exactly, it's clusters. Using Kubernetes to manage Kubernetes, and it's also managed by the Kubernetes project. Specifically, this is a Cluster API. And broadly, and Cluster API Azure more specifically, subprojects of Kubernetes SIG cluster lifecycle. So this is actually part of the Kubernetes organization governed by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. There are Microsoft people who are integral to this project, but it is not governed by or in any way run entirely out of Microsoft. So it's kind of exciting actually, because in this kind of collaborative endeavor, it's kind of the co-opetition, because we're working on Cluster API with all of the other providers across the industry to make sure that all of the customers out there who very much don't care necessarily about the exact nuances between how each provider implements everything, they just want it to work. And we're all collaborating together to make sure it does.
And I know that there is a very vivid community around that, which is something that we're gonna talk about maybe towards the end of the episode. We'll share with people how to get started with this. Cecile, I want to come back to you for a second. Share with me a bit about the architecture. Like how does Cluster API build?
Sure. Yeah. So actually, let me show you a diagram here, which will probably help visualize a little better. So the way Cluster API works is it's separated into providers. And what the providers do is that they help make it very modular. So that means you can plug in different infrastructures and different bootstrap mechanisms. So we have the core Cluster API controllers. And all of this is built, by the way, on Kubernetes controllers and CRDs, which if you're not familiar with, highly recommend going to see an overview of this. It's very interesting, and
Mhm.
we use the power of Kubernetes APIs to build this. So Cluster API, the core controller is the core Cluster API lifecycle logic. So all the lifecycle management, upgrading, rolling updates of machines, all of that.
Mhm.
And then we have the Bootstrap provider, which is how to join a node in the Kubernetes cluster. Cluster API comes with a built-in provider called kubeadm Bootstrap provider. So that's
Mhm.
based on the kubeadm project.
Mhm.
And then we have the infrastructure provider, which is where you basically are having your different infrastructure or like environment, cloud,
Mhm.
anything. And for example, you have an Azure provider, an AWS provider, bare metal provider,
Mhm.
etc. And so what that means really is that the core cluster API logic is really cloud agnostic,
Mhm.
which means that it is shared among all the providers, and then each provider can connect that with their own APIs or their own specifics of how to build that infrastructure for Kubernetes.
And Cecile, something that really clicks when, or clicked for me when I started working with Cluster AI, and specifically with the Azure provider, is that this premise of Kubernetes was created for building other platform. Like it's a platform for building platforms or or solutions. One thing that really clicked for me is the fact that we've been using Kubernetes to build Kubernetes, something like that. If it makes sense, kind of a nested experience. And which leads me to a question that I wanted to ask you. What are the use cases that you're seeing in the wild for Cluster API?
Yeah, so one of the very powerful things about leveraging Cluster API, I think the main premise is that it's declarative. So
Mhm.
having that declarative spec really allows you to integrate with things like GitOps, where you can check in the representation of your cluster into code and use that to manage your cluster infrastructure, your Kubernetes cluster infrastructure.
Mhm.
I think the second use case is having Kubernetes application developers be able to use the exact same gestures that they use for managing their Kubernetes applications to manage their cluster infrastructure. So
Mhm.
that means in practice, you can do kubectl scale dash dash replicas
Mhm.
and scale up your machine pool or your node pool. So that's really, really powerful.
Okay.
I think the third use case that's very important is the fact that it is cloud agnostic and that there's many providers that are out there in the ecosystem. It allows you to manage clusters in multiple infrastructures, multiple clouds the same way. So you can have clusters in Azure and clusters in GCP or any of the other
Mhm.
infrastructures that you use, and they can all be managed from the same management cluster alongside each other. So that's really, really powerful.
One of the things that when I'm getting into a conversation on Cluster API, and I do get into this type of conversation, one of the things that I always like to hear is how people are actually incorporating this into their pipelines, into their CI pipelines or CD pipelines when it comes to that. Which leads me again, just this is a super interesting topic, and I think Bridget, I wanna defer to you for a second because you and I have been talking about this, and one of the things that really comes when we're talking about Cluster API and specifically with Azure, we have AKS. That's something that is very, our customers are very familiar with that. But we also have Cluster API with the Azure provider. Can you maybe clarify for me where does one start, where does one end? Um,
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think probably the first and most important thing to remember is a managed service is always going to be less complicated, simpler for the end user, like full
mhm,
stop. Cluster API in general and Cluster API provider Azure, CAPSI, are not in competition with AKS at all.
mhm,
Like if
mhm,
anyone's workloads can fit into what AKS can provide, we recommend people, the CAPSI team fully endorses using AKS if AKS is right for you. CAPSI, CAPSI is intended to help people self-manage clusters in a declarative, repeatable fashion.
mhm,
That is a lot more fully featured than, you know, some pathways to self-managed clusters. But like there's no competition between, you know, AKS versus CAPC. Which should you use? The answer is you
Mhm.
should use AKS unless you cannot. At which point, and it's sometimes for first party users, it could be a circular dependency, or sometimes for customers, it could be specific things they need to do that maybe are on the AKS roadmap but aren't quite there yet,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
that they need to do something really nuanced and very specific that they cannot do in a managed service. So I don't know if that kind of clarifies when you should
It
use one or
does.
the other. Yeah.
It does, but would it be a fair assumption to say that if I want to get the nerd knobs, I should use Cluster API and not AKS?
So I think I'm going to take a step back from that and say,
Okay.
what is your actual goal? Because if your goal is to play with something super awesome and cool, definitely go check out Cluster API and turn every knob and please contribute to the project. But a lot of end users are trying to have like productivity and
Yeah,
production services, at which point playing with every nerdy knob that they can turn may not be the goal. And it may be what is the best path, the most sustainable and maintainable path to get me to what I'm trying to
got it.
accomplish. So they're kind of different questions. Cluster API is super fun. People should jump in and use it. Should they use it for their production workloads? Maybe, if it meets their needs. So,
Gotcha. Well, that's fair. I mean, at the end of the day, you are accountable for your own infrastructure, your own environment, your own developers experience. If if this is part of your role, and I think that it's a totally fair point. Cecile, I want to ask you something here because Bridget was talking about AKS versus Cluster
Mhm.
API. Where does help me understand where CapZ fits into that, like specifically?
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, so we've been throwing around this acronym CAPZ, but let's clarify for a second. CAPZ
yeah.
is Cluster API Provider Azure. So
Okay.
that's the Azure implementation of Cluster API. CAPZ implements the Cluster API on Azure and helps you build self-managed Azure clusters. What self-managed means is you completely manage the lifecycle of that cluster. It is not an AKS cluster, and you manage the worker nodes and the control plane nodes.
Got it.
So CabZ is great if you do want to manage the lifecycle of your clusters and you do want to have that full end-to-end control and you want to manage the control plane nodes. There are uh, some use cases out there that
Mhm.
make this required for some people, but it's also used to build platforms on top of it, right? It can be very powerful in that way. And in fact, we know of some, platforms out there that are built on top of Cluster API, including
Yeah.
CabZ.
So uh, I like that. I'm a man of options. I really like that I have options, and Cluster API to me represent options. That's something that I like. Also, the providers concept. Those that extensibility model, that Lego bricks model is something that I can very relate to. But Bridget, I do have a question for you. You're a PM in the Azure team. And I've been long enough in Microsoft to just kind of wrap, like in my head, I'm thinking, well, so AKS Engine, I remember that guy. And I used to build like ARM templates that deploy, uh, just kind of own manage Kubernetes
yeah.
clusters. I remember those times. What's the relationship there? Is this still a thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And when you mention the ARM templates, that kind of gives us a hint that, oh, okay, that's a very, it's not life cycle based. It's very imperative. It's very, here's my ARM, send it out into the world, and I hope my cluster is okay later, question mark. Um, so that model is not really the sustainable model going forward
Hmm.
compared to this control loop stuff using Kubernetes to manage Kubernetes that Cecile described. So the AKS engine project is sunsetted. Um, the current version of Kubernetes 1.24 is actually the last version. We've put deprecation notices out there. It's the last version we're going to cut releases for AKS engine because everyone who can is going to AKS these days or is going to CAPZ if their needs are such that they can't use AKS. But it's a really good description, I think, of, oh, I had a very simple way to do it with ARM. And that does work for a very specific set of use cases. But
Hmm.
imagine you're trying to become hybrid or multi-cloud, or,
Yeah.
bridging across your data center and Azure. And suddenly that AKS engine option from the past doesn't really work anymore. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's because the word AKS is in the name, it's a little bit confusing because people think, is that the engine behind AKS? I think I want that. It's like the name is deceptive. Really, it's either AKS or CAPZ is the way forward for either managed or unmanaged clusters
And
on Azure.
Cecile, I remember, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, I still have scars of trying to use AKS engine and incorporating my own VNets into the into the implementation in the architecture. Cecile, I have a question for you on this one because we were talking about CAPZ. So we talked about AKS, we talked about CAPZ. Can I use CAPZ to manage AKS clusters?
Yes, so let's just to add another layer of confusion. Yes, you can. So actually, CAPZ was first designed for self-managed clusters,
Okay.
and that was the main project goal to start. But what happened is people saw this and said, "Well, this is great. I want to use a declarative spec to manage my clusters."
Mhm.
But I don't want self-managed clusters. I want managed Kubernetes clusters. I want AKS. And so what we ended up with is this currently experimental feature on its way to stable to manage AKS clusters via CAPZ. So what that means is we have CRDs and controllers that reconcile an AKS cluster for you using the known stable G8 APIs of AKS. So nothing special there, but it does allow you to manage your AKS clusters alongside any other self-managed or managed cluster using Cluster API.
Gotcha. Well, at the end of the day, like I said, I like options because we have uh, what I'm trying to say is that I think that each and every person or each and every organization or customer, they have their own use cases, right? So
Mhm.
at the end of the day, using CAPZ, to me, it's not confusing. Using CAPZ to deploy AKS cluster in a declarative fashion, that's one option. Obviously, you can do that today with either ARM templates or Bicep or Terraform. You can do that as well, deploying those AKS clusters and Azure CLI, obviously. So, to me, it makes sense. And I like that we have those options.
For sure.
All right. So I actually have a question for you, Lior, because
Yeah.
you're talking about what the Jumpstart team is using and
Yeah.
doing with, CAPZ. And I'm just kind of curious, like, how are you using Cluster API?
Yeah, when I started to explore Cluster API, and I remember the initial conversation that I had with Cecile and the team, I thought to myself, well, this is a very interesting project because of the notion that I can simulate clusters that are deployed outside of Azure, and I didn't want to use AKS because that was something that was not the use case that we wanted to accomplish, right? As part of the Jumpstart, when you're looking at Azure Arc, we wanted to touch on, or we wanted to Arc enable Kubernetes clusters that are not AKS, because we're not expecting people to Arc enable AKS clusters because those are already first party offerings like services. So we wanted to use something that will allow us to do that in a declarative fashion, like Cluster API and the Azure provider is allowing us. And by doing so, we were able to incorporate Cluster API into all the automation. And today, Cluster API and the way that we're provisioning Kubernetes cluster using Cluster API with the Azure provider is actually a fundamental building block to many of the scenarios that we have, and in our box as well. So I'm super happy by the decision that we made around, I want to say, almost 2 years ago by investing the time and invest in Cluster API. So that will be my answer to you on this one, Bridget. So
Wow, early adopters.
we are. I would like to think that we are early adopters, and me and Cecile, we have some interesting conversations around some things that we're also finding in the platform. So definitely, and so I think that. So thanks for the question, Bridget. Definitely a super valid question because this is, we're in Jumpstart Lightning, and I did wanted to share with the viewers what is the relationship here, like why we're even talking about this, not just from a technology standpoint, but also from a use case standpoint. So thank you for that. I want to, Bridget, coming back to you and just kind of maybe wrap things up. We're getting closer to the end of this episode, and I did wanted to, sorry, Cecile, I wanted to ask you this this question. What does, we talked about the current state of Cluster API. We talked a bit about the architecture, and obviously we'll talk more about next steps. But the question that I want to ask you here, like, what does the future holds? Like, how does the project will? What is the inspiration here? Where are we taking this?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So actually, it's important to mention that Cluster API and CabZ both hit the V1 milestone in November 2021. So a bit over 6 months ago. And so since
Yes.
then, the project is considered, yes, mature, and we are recommending it for production. We've seen huge interest at KubeCon EU that just happened. And so it's really, really exciting to be in the project right now because it just seems like things are really taking off. In terms of what's next on the roadmap, there's a lot of focus around UX, improving that day zero UX. Cluster API focuses on the day two operations and managing your cluster over time, but there is some, I think, improvement to be made in around configuration, like getting rid of those huge YAML templates in the first initial deploy. So we have a feature called cluster class, which is aiming to solve that. To reuse different cluster shapes across clusters. And then we have a lot of work to bring the experimental features like AKS and machine pool, which is essentially VMSS for Azure. We want to bring those to stable and just continue with better integration with the ecosystem, like better integration with add-ons, out of tree provider, out of tree cloud provider, out of tree CSI drivers, all the stuff that goes on top of the cluster infrastructure.
So I'm excited because, like I said, we are very much invested in this, and just kind of touching real quick on a point that you made around cluster class, that capability. I would love to see how does that correlate with the things that we're doing today at the back end with customize and how we are actually manipulating all this type of stuff. And like I said, those huge YAMLs that we have that we, luckily we got a hold of those and we know how to deal with them. But definitely would love to see more on that. So for sure, I'm gonna follow up. So, ladies, we're wrapping this episode, and Bridget, I wanna maybe bring us home in terms of how do you actually get started. The one thing I do know that there is a very vivid Slack community for Cluster API, but share with me some details of that, and also how do you actually get started?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So I would say, depending on what your learning style is, you might want to jump in and just take a look at the CAPI or CAPC books, and we'll have some links available here. And if you want to dig in and look on GitHub at the code, that's obviously also available. Sometimes just coming on, Kubernetes Slack to the various cluster API channels is going to be the right move. Honestly, though, one place that you might want to get started just getting to know some of the people and the personalities and finding out what seems approachable for you is you can take a look at the recordings of or even join live to the community calls. And we have a link available that has all of the cluster lifecycle calls, both across the broader CAPI community as well as Cluster API Azure. I think sometimes it's hard to know where to get started when you're presented with lots and lots of issues and pull requests and, jump starts and quick starts and all sorts of places to start. But like, if you see yourself in this project, you can start to see, hey, maybe this specific thing is of interest to me. I can come and listen in on these calls. I can ask a question. I can come into Slack and ask a question. It's a very responsive community. And I think that depending on what your exact desire is, as Cecile mentioned, for example, wanting to move towards using the new workload identity for authentication, everybody who was working in some kind of large enterprise is immediately, their ears perk up when they think about plugging in Active Directory. They're like, oh, yes, that's how we can make this actually production grade. And so there's a lot of nuance there of like things that are on the roadmap that if somebody wanted to get involved in either test out or even help develop the integrations, there's a lot of opportunity for involvement as well as just community support and learning.
Well, a breadth of things. And personally, I can say that I'm a huge fan of the Cluster API and the Azure Provider books. This is always my first go-to personally, because it's built in such a easy way, in terms of, okay, so here are the things that I want to tackle right now. Here are some of the concepts. So I'm definitely a huge fan. And like any like any developer, I also like to go into the GitHub repository and just lurking in the commits and see what's going on there. So that's definitely something that I can also echo and recommend. So um, um, Cecile, Bridget, I really want to say thank you for joining me for the Jumpstart audience. Please make sure that you're liking and subscribing, and also hitting the bell button so you'll know when we're releasing new episode. This was a very exciting episode, Cecile and Bridget. I learned a lot, even though I've been using this project for a while now. There's always room to grow here, and the breadth of this project is just amazing. So thank you for all the hard work that you're doing for the Jumpstart community, but also to the general community. So I really want to say thank you for that.
Thank you. And thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
And for the Jumpstart viewers, we're going to see you next time. Bye, everyone.